listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hi, my name is Barbara Mendes-George, and I'm a sustainability communications expert based in Brussels, Belgium. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Let's Talk Sustainable Business, a series brought to you by the Conference Board. Today is the first of a two-part conversation with Anne-Sophie Garrigou, Director of Editorial and Campaigns at Climate KIC, a European agency tackling climate change through innovation. Climate KIC is focused on building climate resilience worldwide, and it works with countries, regions, cities, and businesses using a systems change approach to bridge the gap between climate commitments and current reality. Anne-Sophie is a climate journalist and communications professional, having previously worked for Groupe Sud-Ouest and AFP. She is the founder of the Beam magazine, a media platform dedicated to highlighting sustainable innovations and amplifying underrepresented voices in climate discourse. She also founded WICA, or WICA, a magazine dedicated to shining a spotlight on the women who are leading the charge in the global battle against climate change. Anne-Sophie hosts Climate KIC's podcast How Could We?, where she interviews a range of people across the world who are putting transformative and innovative ideas for tackling climate change into practice. So this week's theme is Climate Conferences as Platforms for Change. The geopolitical consequences of climate change cannot be overstated. International political collaboration through climate diplomacy is crucial to avoid the worst consequences of a much warmer world. The European Union External Action Service says, the EU fully recognises that the accelerating triple planetary crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution is an existential threat. The effects of climate change and environmental degradation also accentuate threats to peace, stability, and security. A crucial event in the climate diplomacy calendar is the United Nations Climate Change Conferences, held yearly in the framework of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. They serve as a formal meeting, a conference of the parties, or a COP. So the first COP, COP1, took place in Berlin in 1995, and this year's COP, COP30, is taking place in Belém, Brazil. Key COPs in the past have included COP3 in Kyoto, which saw the development of the Kyoto Protocol to reduce greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere to a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Another important COP is COP21 in Paris, which saw the adoption of the Paris Agreement, a successor to the Kyoto Protocol, to keep the rise in global surface temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. While the EU has been increasing its commitment to combating climate change and participates multilaterally in events like the UNFCCC COPs, the strategic landscape for climate diplomacy has changed, with cooperation weakened by fragmentation and power politics worldwide. And while the EU consensus on flagship policy, the EU Green Deal, and other key EU sustainability measures is shifting, the European Commission is currently developing a new global climate and energy vision to be released ahead of COP30. As a climate conference veteran, Anne-Sophie can hopefully help us make sense of the status of climate diplomacy. So welcome, Anne-Sophie. I'm really looking forward to talking to you today about climate conferences and climate diplomacy.
Hi, Barbara. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. And thanks for already laying out so much of the jargon of the COP and the UNFCCC process.
Thank you. I'm trying to make it as understandable as possible. So even if you've never heard of or been to one of these conferences, hopefully that's a decent introduction. Could I start by asking you to explain what your role is at Climate KIC?
Yeah, so I started at Climate KIC about 5 years ago now, and I had been working in the media for about 10 years, as you said before, including as the editor-in-chief of the Beam magazine. And so while I was working there, I realized that many climate organizations were not really investing a lot in good communications. So that's what kind of brought me to Climate KIC. As you said, it was established in 2010 by the European Institute of Innovation and Technology. And yeah, the goal was to support the development and scaling of sustainable ventures or startup through tailored business creation, acceleration programs, etc. And what really attracted me to Climate KIC at the time was their commitment to systemic change. And when I started, that was one of the few organizations that was recognizing publicly that single point solution, as in replacing one technology for another, which might be more sustainable, was never going to be enough to tackle the immense climate challenges. So, yeah, they also had similar issues to other organizations at the time in terms of communication. And it was very difficult, I think, for people outside of the organization to understand concretely what they were doing and what was their actual impact on people and communities. And of course, when you work on climate, you need people to understand what the impact of those policies or programs are going to have on people. So I started at Climate KIC as media lead. And at first, I was really trying to help the organization get media attention. And then I created an editorial function, and we started to change some of the ways we were doing things. And yeah, I'm now campaigns and editorial director or orchestrator, and that means I lead those efforts, the campaigns and editorial efforts within the comms team. I'm working with amazing communication colleagues to design and deliver communication campaigns on themes like urban transformation, climate adaptation, food system transformation, you name it. And yeah, we try to work around how we talk about those things and how do we demonstrate impact and what systemic change looks like in practice for people.
Yeah, I think what's really nice about Climate KIC is it's working with so many different stakeholders in so many different areas. I think, I've worked with you, full disclosure, it does feel like you're really doing your best to make a difference where it's needed, right?
And it takes a lot of time, and yeah, but it proves to be very impactful.
So you mentioned systems thinking, and I talked about system change thinking in the introduction. So could you just expand a little bit into that and why it has become a key approach for Climate KIC's work?
Yeah, so I'm going to try to make it as comprehensible as possible. So systems change thinking it's an approach that recognizes that climate change as a challenge. It's complex, but it's also interconnected with many other challenges, right? So that means it cannot be solved through those isolated interventions or single technological fixes. So I'm going to give you an example. If you replace all cars with electric vehicles in a city, you will address the carbon emissions problem, but you leave all the underlying urban mobility system unchanged. So you still have traffic congestion, the need for extensive parking infrastructure, from tire and brake particles, road safety issues, and of course the social isolation that car dependent cities create. So in that context, a systems transformation approach to urban mobility would look at rethinking, reimagining how people move through cities entirely. So, for instance, if you go to cities like Copenhagen or Paris or Barcelona, they've done systems level changes. They redesign completely urban spaces to prioritize walking, cycling, public transit over private vehicles. They created integrated mobility networks where different modes of transport work great together. They restructured the whole urban planning to bring services closer to where people live, which reduced the need for long commutes. And they transformed streets from car corridors into community spaces, like you would see in Paris, for instance. Like some of the school streets are now only for pedestrian.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is what we call a systemic approach. And so instead of just decreasing emission, which is what we call, the climate mitigation, which is very important, but you also create healthier, more livable cities where people have better air quality, more social interaction, reduced noise, and then people can really feel the positive impact of those policies or transformation. And that's what we call a systemic transformation. And what we do at Climate KIC is really to support cities, regions, and governments who have high ambition to do just that.
Mm-hmm.
And we demonstrate what is possible. So we don't just work with governments, but also with the industries, with community groups, with businesses and residents together to redesign the entire ecosystem and the social and economic structures that support the system. And so, just to add, like, I think instead of just addressing symptoms, basically, we help stakeholders understand and transform the structures, the relationships, and the patterns that create and maintains those problems.
It's super interesting. And I know that in some of the work you've done, what is very important is in the discussions when you're trying to enact those systems changes, it's the importance of having all the different types of voices, right? Like it's not just about having the top policymakers or CEOs. You really want every type of person from every level. Is that correct?
Exactly. So it really means looking at how economic financial models, political structures, social behaviors, technological system, all of those interact to perpetuate or to solve the challenges, right? So I think Climate KIC is one of the organizations that recognized that a while ago, and they recognize also that the scale and speed of change that is needed for, achieving the Paris Agreement requires the transformation of whole systems. So it's you really have to think about how you produce and consume, how cities function, how food systems operate, how economic incentives are structured as well. So it's very interesting. It's very complex and it's complicated to explain sometimes, but very interesting work.
Very interesting. Great. So, in your biography, you mentioned that you're passionate about climate diplomacy and negotiations and fascinated by the complex power dynamics at play in these international forums like the UNFCCC COPs. So, what sparked your interest in them? Was it going to them or already observing from afar you were interested?
Yeah, a bit of both. So I come from a very small village of 300 inhabitants, right, in the south of France. And, it's not in the glamorous Provence, but it's in Dordogne. And when I was attending COP24 in Katowice in Poland, people in France were protesting at the moment. I don't know if you remember the Gilets jaunes movements. It started because of President Macron's proposed fuel tax increase. And yeah, during this conference, it was my second COP, I think, and I was calling my dad, who'd been protesting also on the roundabout against the tax with friends and people from the community. And he was saying that people like him felt like those of us at this big international conference simply didn't get it and didn't understand the real impact of climate policies on ordinary people's daily life. And honestly, I had to agree with him, right? So that conversation, I've already had worked on justice issues for a long time, but that really became sort of a turning point for me because it sparked this fascination about the power dynamics at play in these international forums and on climate diplomacy. I remember at this conference, there was a representative from Greenpeace France who said that people who were protesting didn't understand the tax. And I was like, well, that's a very privileged position to have, right? Because those people, they don't have the choice to use their cars or things like this. And this is just obviously one example. But I started really asking myself questions on how do communities, especially those without significant resources, get their voices heard in these spaces, right? When even organizations like Greenpeace and others don't represent them. And how do countries, even that can't afford to send large delegations, ensure their interests are represented? Our negotiators from small island states, which are disappearing, like Vanuatu or Kiribati, or the ones from least developed countries, genuinely listen to when they speak. We see at COPs a lot of like indigenous people, but then you go to the press conferences and they speak in Portuguese and there is no translation. So that means there is no journalist that, English speaking journalist that can actually convey their message. So, I mean, for me, climate action, it's always been about justice, about fairness, about historical responsibility. But I really witnessed firsthand how these dynamics play out. And yeah, one of the COP I went to, that was Dubai, which was like massive COP. The negotiation rooms were too small to accommodate everyone who needed to be there. So you'd see a wealthy country like Australia arriving with 15 or 20 delegates, while representatives from smaller, more vulnerable nations had to fight just to get into the room. And that was from crucial negotiations on climate adaptation, where their participation is not only important, it's absolutely essential because it's about their communities' lives. So that really is something that captivates me about climate diplomacy. I'm a bit of a climate diplomacy nerd, but understanding how power, resources, representation intersect in these critical moments where our sort of global response to climate change is being shaped, I found this fascinating.
That's really interesting that you use the example of like the macro and the micro, right? You're at this big climate conference, but you're having a conversation with your dad who is kind of on the ground and feeling the real effects. Yeah, that's it.
It was,
Yeah.
yeah, it was also like feeling your own contradictions, right? Of like coming from this space and understanding those people and now arriving in those big conference and being part of the people who are like trying to fix the problem, but like feeling the disconnection between the two.
And I don't know if you'd agree, but I do feel like these days the social justice side of tackling climate change is a bit more prevalent, more than in COP24. People do see how, they're obviously linked, but sometimes feel like they're at odds, right? So having to pick
Yeah,
one
I
over the
think,
other is what some people think.
no, you're right. And I think maybe because something that I realized the past couple of years, I think that really the impact of climate change have accelerated like even much faster than scientists in COP21 when the Paris Agreement was signed were predicting, right? And I think at 10 years ago, we thought that most of the climate impacts were going to happen sort of far away. And there is a rule when you study journalism on like how people are interested or not in your the news or you think you're going to write about. And obviously, the further it is from the place, then the least interesting it is. But the thing we're realizing right now is climate change is that it's also happening right now. It's happening in Germany, it's happening in France, in Spain. Their impact on people. And I think from where we are both sitting in Europe right now, and we can see that it's impacting communities around us much more than 10 years ago and much more than what was predicted.
Absolutely.
It hits closer to home.
Yeah, in Belgium, there were these historic floods a few years ago, and there was a big climate protest afterwards, and a woman was holding up a sign saying, "I am a climate refugee," because her house had been destroyed. The other thing your answer made me think of is there's a quote that I've seen going around more and more on social media, which is the impacts of climate change are happening on your phone until they get closer and closer. You'll see the impacts of climate change on your phone until they get closer and closer to you, which I think in Europe we definitely see that.
No, and I think on climate refugees, actually a very good point because 10 years ago, or even, 5 years ago, maybe when we were talking about climate refugees, we were imagining those like flows of people coming from African countries to Europe. And it's like, this is a complete misrepresentation. Like climate refugees is actually happening much more inside the country or in the regional area, right? So, it's really, I think people are realizing, not everyone of course, but people are realizing more and more because they're experiencing it, that climate change is going to have an impact on their life and their kids' life.
Yeah, absolutely. So what role do you see the UNFCCC COPs playing in global climate diplomacy, and how has this evolved over the years?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to tell you something that people I interviewed over the years have been telling me. At the moment, this is the only space we have at this scale. This is the best space we have. It's full of issues, but we need to nurture it because we don't have anything better. So there's been so much criticism lately on the role of the UNFCCC and the role of the COPs in general. It needs to evolve, of course, but it is right now the best chance we have. So the first COPs I went to were smaller also than the most recent ones. And to me, it really feels like the last few years have become a little bit of a climate fair trade, right? With the COP in Dubai hosting around 100,000 delegates. So there is more and more businesses being done at COP. There is more and more business being done at COP. A lot of people and organizations aren't here for the negotiations, but to meet with potential partners or clients. So yeah, if you're working around climate, it's the place to be. But to go back to your question, I think the COPs should evolve from being primarily about establishing frameworks and commitments, which is what they've been doing for like 30 years, to become more focused on implementation and accountability and addressing the gaps, the equity gaps that have always existed but are not now more visible and urgent. So yeah, I think that's the way forward, and that's what the Brazil presidency is focusing on. You said in your introduction that the first COPs were about getting countries to agree on basic principles and targets. You mentioned the Kyoto Protocol. The focus was on getting developed countries to commit to emission reductions. And the process was more about negotiating what should be done rather than how to actually do it. So the Paris Agreement in 2015 was really a shift, and we can see at the Climate Week in New York that is happening this week as we're recording, it still drives a lot of momentum. It sort of introduced this bottom-up approach where countries set their own nationally determined contributions. So those are the NDCs that people may have, seen or heard talk about in the media. And that was very pragmatic because it recognized that the old binary division between developed and developing countries didn't really reflect reality, right? And that all countries needed to participate according to their capabilities. So, yeah, I think the COPs are evolving, but of course, I think what we have to admit and what everyone realize is that the COPs alone cannot deliver the transformation we need, right? They've become more about creating the enabling conditions, so setting standards, mobilizing finance, sharing technology, building accountability mechanism. But the real work happens between COPs, of course, in cities, in businesses, in communities.
It's interesting because I've worked in the climate/sustainability space, I think a similar amount of time to you, and the perceived importance of these climate change conferences and the amount of coverage they get seems to vary widely, right? Because I remember Copenhagen 2009, which was seen as as a a bad conclusion, and that was around the time that there was the financial crisis, and then
Yeah.
that was what just when I started working in sustainability, and there seemed to be a lot of cynicism. Then we moved through the 2010s, that changed a bit, but now I feel like we're back in a similar environment. So, has each COP that you've attended felt different, and have some felt more hopeful or productive than others?
Completely. Every COP felt very different.
Mm-hmm.
So I think every country, so every COP is hosted by a different country. It's the presidency changes every year, and every country brings something specific to the COP processes. I really love the Fiji COP, which was hosted in Bonn in Germany, and I don't know if it was because it was my first COP, and being around so many like climate people, but you could really feel the impacts of the culture of the small island states in the
Interesting.
negotiation rooms and in the conference hall, and it was like a happy COP, and I think we were still on a high,
Mm-hmm.
because it was a couple of years after the Paris Agreement. And then yeah, lately we had a few like more difficult ones. Katowice in Poland was absolutely surreal for me. You could literally feel the pollution from the nearby coal mines in the air as you walked through the city. And yeah, the Polish pavilion, which is meant to showcase a country's ideas and host conversation, was essentially an exhibition celebrating coal,
Yeah.
right? So and then Egypt, of course, brought its own challenges because of the restrictions on civil society. So it was very, very difficult for like climate civil society. Dubai felt like a show. Like it felt like the country put on a show. It was like more a fair trade than anything else. I told you before that 100,000 delegates were
Mm-hmm.
attending, and it was also more and more lobbying being done, from the fossil fuel industry, with a record number of fossil fuel industry attending. Um, so yeah, just now a lot of eyes are turning towards Brazil, right? And this COP is hosted not in the capital city, but in Belém, which you said, which is near the Amazon forest. And that was very a deliberate choice from Brazil to bring people to this area. And I think what's really interesting about this one is that the presidency has announced very early on that they wanted it to be the COP of people, the COP of implementation. And that sparked a lot of expectation and a lot of hope that this one can help turn ambition into action. So yeah.
Great, thank you. To wrap up part one, I wanted to ask you, with most of our listeners located in the business world, what role do businesses play in events like the UNFCCC COPs, and what role generally do you feel that businesses can and
Mhm.
should be playing in climate diplomacy and interacting with policymakers?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the first thing to recognize is that the business world is already being and will be increasingly affected by the climate crisis, right?
Hmm.
So, floods, heat waves, supply chain disruptions, these things directly affect how business operate. And I think today no company can afford to ignore what's coming, and adapting is going to be essential. So that's like the first reason why, for me, they need to be included or to feel like they should take part. And at the same time, of course, businesses have a massive role to play in driving the transformation we need. That means working alongside government organizations and communities to help reshape the economies and societies that we know in a way that are sustainable and fair and equitable. So now when it comes to COP specifically, we already see a lot of like business coalitions being formed and speaking up and supporting negotiations. Businesses supporting their country to push forward for positive negotiation. But what worries me at the same time is, of course, when industries, for instance, like the fossil fuel companies, use their influence to slow
Mm.
things down, right? And that happens as well. So a few years ago, for example, the CEO of Total Energy actually attended with a party badge, so as part of the French delegation, right?
Hmm.
And is not the only one, of course, but that for me is a red flag. So I think the role of business should be sending a positive, I think the role of business should be to send a positive signal to policymakers. We're ready, we're here to support, we want to be part of the solution, and they absolutely need to be in the room. But yeah, to push it forward. And yeah, we know it at Climate KIC. We're working with 112 cities on urban transformation, especially around decarbonization. And so what one of the blocker that we have is that the industry, the businesses isn't ready to provide the cities with everything they need to achieve net zero emissions by 2030. So there really is a need for the business and industries to come together to align with the ambition that are being taken by national and subnational governments.
Thank you very much, Anne-Sophie, and thank you for joining us today. So this is the first of a 2-part episode. Join us next time for part 2, and thanks to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to this podcast series and explore the entire catalogue of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcasts. See you next time.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.